So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am John M. Templeton, Jr., the president of the John Templeton Foundation. It's a great privilege for me to introduce to you this evening the 2010 Templeton Prize laureate, Dr. Francisco Ayala, the Donald Brin Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of California in Irvine. This particular picture took place this past May in Buckingham Palace when Prince Philip, who every year since the prize began in 1974 has always generously presided in the formal ceremony for making the prize award. In a few moments, Professor Ayala will share with us some thoughts on his life's work in molecular evolution and genetics, the philosophy of biology, and the rightful roles of both science and religion in fostering research and discovery for scientific and spiritual progress. He will then welcome your questions. Before that, however, I would like to say a few words about the origin and the aims of the Templeton Prize. The Templeton Prize is the world's largest annual prize given to a living individual. In its history, the prize is one of the most significant cornerstones for the John Templeton Foundation's international efforts to serve as a philanthropic catalyst for discovery in a diversity of areas through the asking of what we call big questions. We support innovative research in a range of disciplines from theoretical physics, evolutionary biology, to philosophy, to theology, and to a variety of social sciences on core subjects such as love, gratitude, creativity, forgiveness, and other spiritual realities. We are devoted to helping the world's finest minds investigate not only the laws of nature, but the more challenging issues of human and divine purpose. My father's overriding commitment was to progress through rigorous scientific research and related scholarship. The Foundation's motto, "How little we know, how eager to learn," exemplifies our support for open-minded inquiry. By honoring those whose research and discoveries have opened new perspectives on questions of ultimate reality and purpose, the Templeton Prize fosters an environment that encourages others to help us more fully understand the functional and foundational roots of ourselves and our universe. As noted, the prize honors a living person who has made an exceptional contribution to affirming life's spiritual dimension, especially when assessed from the widest possible perspectives. The prize is designed to bring attention to the fact that all monumental discoveries reflect what might be called entrepreneurs of the spirit, that truth is real and that truth is approachable. What these extraordinary people have shared is a devotion to one or more of the big questions at the core of the John Templeton Foundation's mandate. All of them have been seekers of wisdom, humbled by the complexity of both the human condition and the eons that mark the known universe. Nominations are sought every year for committed, innovative, probing questioners and seekers from those whose lifetime's work have emerged fresh ideas and persuasive insights into new dimensions of spiritual and material realities. We urge you to go onto the website for www.templetonprize.org and to consider the various criteria for the prize, especially if you might have in mind somebody that you would like to nominate. We recognize that human beings and their spiritual bearings from a range of experiences, including but certainly not limited to the most far-reaching discoveries in modern science. My father, therefore, wanted to encourage other brilliant minds to address what he called the ageless questions, questions that he believed could inspire people today just as they have inspired people throughout the ages. These questions include, and here again I quote some of the questions he put forward. What is the best way to live? How large is God? How are finite beings related to the infinite? What was God's purpose in creating the universe? How can we be helpful? This is the sort of far-reaching inquiry that the Templeton Prize is meant to encourage. As my father said of these questions, they link the human soul to philosophy and the love of wisdom. This line of thinking explains why we are here today to honor Professor Francisco Ayala, a biologist and philosopher of unsurpassing distinction and a thinker who, while vigorously opposing the entanglement of science and religion, has also championed faith as a unique and important window to the understanding of purposes, values, and the meaning of life. During his 40-year career, in which he has written more than 1,000 papers and some 35 books, Professor Ayala has devoted his attention to very many substantial big questions, such as, does scientific knowledge contradict religious belief? Why do humans behave ethically? And do we have free will? The remarkable mind of Professor Ayala and his passion for discovery arose from an early interest in science, an interest that was cultivated by the priests who taught at the private Catholic schools he attended in Spain. After he received a bachelor's in science and physics from the University of Madrid in 1955, Professor Ayala went on to study theology at the Pontifical Faculty of San Esteban in Salamanca. He was next ordained as a Dominican priest in 1960, but he chose instead to leave the priesthood to continue his studies, now in the area of genetics. He thus moved to New York City in 1961 to study at Columbia. Through an introduction by his colleagues at Salamanca, young Ayala met the Ukrainian-born scientist Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is still considered to be among the 20th century's most distinguished geneticists and evolutionary biologists. Ayala received his PhD from Dobzhansky in 1964 with a thesis that established that rates of evolution depend on the genetic variation of the species, a paper and a perspective which became quite generative in a wider, growing variety of newer discoveries. Dr. Ayala later discovered highly accurate ways to read genetic clocks to determine the timing of the precise steps in the evolution of a species over millions or maybe billions of years. Recently, he and his colleagues determined that malaria was very likely first transmitted from the chimpanzee to humans a mere 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, amazingly, perhaps through one single mosquito. At the University of California, Irvine, Dr. Ayala was awarded the title of University Professor, the highest rank within the California University system, and the only person there at Irvine to hold that title. This title is accentuated by his current several professorships in biology, philosophy, logic, and philosophy of biology, a field he himself helped to inaugurate. While with this background from his earlier theological education, Professor Ayala has nevertheless vigorously opposed the entanglement of science and religion, but he has also called for mutual respect between the two, including open-minded inquiry into big questions, questions that at least partially may be relevant to each domain of knowing. In his commitment to the unique integrity of each domain, he served in 1981 as an expert witness in a pivotal U.S. federal court challenge that led to the overturning of an Arkansas law mandating that the teaching of creationism had to be taught alongside of evolution. At that time, he equated efforts to block religious intrusions into science with the survival of rationality in this country. Among Professor Ayala's signature publications include Science, Evolution, and Creationism, a categorical refutation of creationism and so-called intelligent design. Later in 2007, Ayala wrote Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion, a broad review of the proper context of science and religion in modern society. Among a vast range of honors and special responsibilities include in 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed Professor Ayala to the U.S. President's Commission of Advisors on Science and Technology. Also, while he served as president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science from 1993 to 1996, he developed the AAAS Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Also in 2001, President George W. Bush awarded Professor Ayala the National Medal of Science. As you have an opportunity to listen to Professor Ayala this evening, who will speak to us on the topic, Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion, I would like to ask you to listen for those qualities of Professor Ayala as a dedicated seeker of truth. Part of that truth, which itself is awesome in respect to the majesty of genetics and the unlimited dimensionality of DNA, that every unfolding of evolving mysteries of life also unavoidably raise a number of fundamental big questions, including questions with the potential for spiritual discoveries. From a more cosmic perspective, might what Professor Ayala shows us is that God's greatest love gift to each one of us and to all of his children who ever were is the mind. From awakened mind comes not only what questions and how questions, but especially why questions. The quest or the vision for this quest that Professor Ayala offers to us is the pursuit of still unanswered questions regarding the codes and the mysteries of life. Professor Ayala offers each one of us here tonight and for a much wider audience beyond a challenge and the opportunity that may, as you yourself learn and grow, that you may feel or begin to feel a prompting and therefore an eagerness within you to define your own big questions and to then join with others in the pursuit of newer answers and insights. The message of Professor Ayala's life's work, and even what he shares with us tonight, is that the baton of newer discoveries is already passing to you here with us and to all those who will read or hear this message later. So please join me, therefore, in extending a warm welcome to Professor Francisco Ayala, who will speak to us on the topic of Darwin's gift to science and religion and his larger message to us tonight. Professor Ayala.
Thank you very much, Dr. Templeton, for your generous and gracious introduction. And thank you and the Templeton Foundation for this great honor of the Templeton Prize, which I surely will treasure all my life. It's also a pleasure and an honor to be here addressing the American Academy of Religion, or at least people attending the American Academy of Religion. On April 28, 1937, early in the Spanish Civil War, Nazi airplanes under the command of General Franco bombed the city of Guernica, a civilian population, not a military target of any sort, population of about 7,000 people, 25% of them, men, women, and children, were dead. The first time that the civilian populations had been intentionally bombed from the air. Surely because the Nazis were starting to try the weapons that they would be using in the Second World War that was anticipated to come very soon, and surely also because Franco wanted to punish the Basque. Guernica, this small town, was considered, and it is considered, the spiritual home of the Basques. Pablo Picasso, the great Spanish painter, had been commissioned by the Republican government to paint a mural for the world exhibit that was going to take place in Paris in October of that year. Hearing of the massacre, Picasso, in a fit of manic energy and fury, he outlined in 2 days and sketched in 12 days, fully sketched in 12 days, this painting, the Guernica, the name of the town, an enormous painting, nearly 23 feet long and 9 feet high. Well, we would all agree that this painting was painted for a purpose, to convey a message, the horrors of the war in general, and the humanity of human to human. In the same way that we would agree that the watch has been designed to tell the time, and a car has been designed for transportation. These are butterfly wings. You can see there the letters of the alphabet and the digits. We could use these letters to write text in English and the numbers for arithmetic calculation, but we would all agree that that's not the reason why these butterfly wings have these particular designs. In the same way that we can use mountains for skiing and rivers for navigation, but that's not why the mountains exist or the rivers flow. What about the human eye? A message of my lecture today would be that the eye shares something in common with the painting and with the watch and with the car, and something in common with the butterfly wings and the mountains and the rivers. What it shares in common with the painting is that if it were not for the purpose it serves, namely seeing, the eye would not have come to exist. What it shares with the butterfly wings is that it has come about by natural processes. We owe this discovery that the sign can come about by natural processes to Charles Darwin on the origin of the species. There is a narrative in the history of ideas that says there were two great revolutions, the Copernican and the Darwinian. The Copernican consisted in removing the Earth from being the center of the universe to being just one more planet revolving around the sun, and the Darwinian revolution consisted in removing humans from being the center of all the living species in the world to become just one more of them, and a latecomer one at that. Copernicus, on the year of his death in 1543, published on the revolutions of the celestial bodies. Here is a representation of the world as it was seen at the time. This is a German textbook of the middle of the 16th century, and you can see here the Earth in the middle with the moon, and then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Solis, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the constellations of the stars. Here we have a drawing from Copernicus' book by his own hand, and we see Sun in the center, Mercury, Venus, then Earth with the moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the constellations. Because both books, the German and the Copernicus book, like all the scientific books and philosophical books, theological books at the time, all scholarship was written in Latin. Darwin, in 1859, 151 years ago, published The Origin of a Species by means of natural selection, where the Darwinian revolution is said to have removed humans from being the center of the living world to being just one more species, closely related to the chimpanzees and to other apes species, and through them to the rest of the living world. These two narratives of the history of science, of the two great revolutions, are unsatisfactory. Not for what they say that it is correct, but for what they do not say, which is the most important one. To understand the meaning of the Copernican revolution, one has to see it in terms of some of his followers, which I have listed here, two of them only, about 100 years apart from each other and from him, Galileo and Newton. What the Copernican revolution really represents, seen it in the context of his followers, is a commitment to the notion that the physical world consists of matter in motion governed by natural laws. And these laws can be discovered, and they are simple laws that apply on Earth as well as in the heavens, and they can be subject to test by observation and experiment. Simple laws like force equal mass times acceleration, or the inverse square law of attraction, that the attraction of two bodies is proportional to the product of the masses, but inversely related to the square of the distance. The Copernican revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries had left out organisms, and for a good reason, which was articulated better than anybody else sometime later by William Paley. William Paley was an English clergyman, theologian, author of several books, which were part of the canon at Cambridge, where Darwin was a student in the second, third decade of the 19th century. William Paley was also a very successful public speaker, particularly as an abolitionist. There was at the time still slavery in the UK. In 1800, he became sick and decided to dedicate his time to study biology. There had been tremendous advances in biological knowledge throughout the 18th century. He studied them, and in 1802, he published this magnificent book, Natural Theology, 430 pages or so, where he argues again and again that all organisms and their parts give convincing evidence of design. So he uses one example, the human eye, that we'll see in a moment, but he goes through all other parts of humans, the relations between humans and other animals and the environment, and the relationships between the sexes, and so on. And again, he comes to the same conclusion. Only God, an omnipotent being, the omnipotent creator, benevolent, could account for the beautiful design and the perfection of these organisms. He starts by saying, assume that I'm taking a walk with a friend and accidentally I kick a piece of stone. And my friend says, where did that stone come from? For all what I know, Paley says in his narrative, it could have been there forever. There is nothing to explain. But assume that I take a few more steps and now I kick a watch. I know that explanation won't do. A watch is made of complex parts, has been clearly designed to tell time. Where there is a watch, there is a watchmaker. And then he extends this argument on and on to, as I have said, all sorts of organisms and their parts. Well, it was Darwin's genius to complete the Copernican revolution by bringing the design of organisms into the realm of science. He did so with the Origin of a Species, the subtitle of which is By Means of Natural Selection. Darwin saw this book at this time as a summary of a big treatise that he was writing, multi-volume book that was to be called Natural Selection. That's why he chose not to call this summary book the Natural Selection. But The Origin of a Species is not a book primarily about evolution. It's about natural selection, about how to explain design as a result of natural processes. The first 8 chapters explain natural selection, and then at the beginning of the 9th chapter, he says, as it were, well, if my theory of natural selection is correct, evolution must have occurred, but it must have occurred in this particular way. evolution was fairly generally accepted by biologists at the time, in the middle of the 19th century. But more often than not, it was thought, like in the case of Lamarck, a French author who published his book about evolution in 1809, the year in which Darwin was born, that evolution implied that all organisms were changing in all respects, with respect to all their parts, gradually and continuously, and becoming higher, in the language of the time, more and more advanced. Darwin says nothing of the kind is the way evolution should occur if it's by natural selection. Some organisms may not even change at all for centuries, for millions of years. He gives two examples. I will show or refer you to one of them. He says they will change one part or another depending on what the challenges of the environment are. He elaborates then the evidence for evolution and showing that it has occurred in 5 chapters, 2 dedicated to what we call nowadays paleontology, he called it geology, 2 dedicated to geography, and 1 to comparative anatomy and embryology. And then the final chapter, chapter 14, is dedicated again to natural selection and to a summary of his work. Here is one of the places where he summarizes or introduces the concept of natural selection. A very simple concept. He says, based on the experience of farmers, and animal breeders, they would select animals with certain characteristics of plants or whether fruits or grains or whatever, with characteristics that are desired by us, says, can be thought improbable, seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred, that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur in the course of thousands of generations. If such to occur, can we doubt that individuals having any advantage over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? On the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious could be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations and rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. So we have dogs with characteristics that have arisen spontaneously, but we have selected to have the breeds of dogs that we want, and the same with chicken producing more eggs, or with wheat or corn or whatever, having more and more the attributes that we want. If these variations occur in animals and plants that are useful to us, there must be some that are useful to them. And those who have the useful variations, therefore, will survive and procreate with a higher probability, with more likely success, and therefore these variations will be multiplied through time. This is the basic concept of natural selection. Nowadays we have a tremendous mathematical apparatus and all sorts of information around it, but the concept in itself is just simple. In the final decade of the 18th century and in the 19th century, geology had come of age. It had been discovered that where the land is exposed, that the land consists in most places of strata that actually have been formed at the bottom of the ocean by gradual sediment, and therefore that when fossils are found, as they are found, this is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, those fossils that appear at higher levels have lived later than those that are below. There are more than 1 billion years of evolution here, and of course more than 1 mile vertical fall. So scientists were able to reconstruct the history, the paleontological history of phylogenetic history, as sometimes we call it, of organisms, like I've done here for the horse. This is a model representation. The first horse-like creature lived somewhere more than 50 million years ago. Here you have the scale on time. Was a small animal the size of a medium-sized dog, and eventually increased in size. The number of toes changes, and many other things change. I am using this figure also to illustrate the way in which we evolutionists represent the origin of new species and also their extinction. When a new species arises, it's shown as a new branch, and when it becomes extinct, it just ends. Notice that at various times there have been all sorts of species of horses. At a few million years ago, many of them, by the way, most of them in America, where they became extinct and eventually were imported from Spain, from a native country in the early 16th century, to come to the modern horse. Well, Darwin's contemporaries said if there have been this gradual evolution, there has been this gradual evolution from one kind of organism to another, where are the intermediates? Where are the missing links? And they were not known during Darwin's time major links, that is, transitions between major groups of organisms. One was discovered 2 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. Darwin was sure that this would be discovered. This is Archaeopteryx. I don't think you need to pay much attention to realize that he has wings, like a bird. It has other characteristics like birds, but others which are very clear, like a dinosaur, a reptile, including a long tail, teeth that we don't see here in the beak, and so on. Darwin incorporated this in the later editions of The Origin of a Species. We have now found transitional organisms between all sorts of major groups of organisms. Here you have another transitional organism between reptiles and birds, one earlier than Archaeopteryx. It already shows some signs of, that are characteristic of birds, but by and large, and that's why I'm showing it here, is still a dinosaur. This has just been discovered 2 years ago, and covered by Chinese paleontologists. Here you have another example, in this case the transition between fish and amphibians, between life in the water and life on the earth. Up to a few years ago, these two species were known, as well as these two. These two are clearly fish, although they show some signs, the configuration of the cranium and other things that look like incipient amphibians. These two up here retain some characteristics of birds, as you can see, but they already have extremities. They are very much amphibians. Acanthostega, this organism lived 370 million years ago. Panderectis, this one, lived 380 million years ago. A group of scientists at the University of Chicago, paleontologists, decided to look in sediments that will be 375 million years ago, approximately, which will be intermediate between the true still something which is a true fish and something which is a true amphibian. And after several seasons, several years of going there to very northern Canada, the very frozen parts of Canada, eventually uncovered a number of organisms, actually 20 species, 20 specimens, 20 individuals of this organism Dictalic, which is as intermediate between fish and amphibians as you may want. Needless to say, to Darwin's critics in his time and nowadays, the issue about the missing links concerns primarily humans. If we and primates and other primates have common ancestors, where are the intermediates? Well, none were known in Darwin's times, we are talking particularly, as we now know, to the organisms that live ancestors after the human lineage separated from that of the chimpanzee. Now we know that the chimpanzees are our closest relatives. They're more closely related to us than they are to the gorillas, or than we are to the gorillas. Well, nowadays we have dozens of species. This is only a simplified representation of the transitional organisms between apes and humans, starting with several species that lived about 7 million years ago, and they are represented here. I will not go into the details. Only about 2 million years ago, we have a species that it is given the same generic name as ours, Homo, man or human, that lived from somewhat before 2 million years ago to a little, somewhat beyond 2 million years ago. And then we have other species, and there we are. We have been about only for 150,000 years, that in the scale of life is a very short time indeed. The discovery of human intermediates got a great impulse in about 35 years ago. A group of scientists from the University of California in Berkeley discovered an exemplar of this species, Australopithecus afarensis, called Lucy. 40% of a single individual have been found together. Now we have skeletons much more complete. But these scientists from Berkeley managed to manipulate the media in very clever ways, including naming this fossil Lucy at the time when Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the song from the Beatles, was in fashion, and in other ways with wonderful consequences for human paleontology, namely that the National Science Foundation, other foundations in other countries, and as well as private foundations, started to invest a lot of money in looking for human fossils. That is why we have all these species and many more that I'm not representing here. Well, two things happen relatively quickly in the evolutionary scale in the evolution of the human lineage. One is that very early our ancestors become bipedal. The other one is that they have acquired large brain. They happen at different times, just as Darwin said it should be happening. I'm going to show only you the kind of evidence that shows that Lucy was bipedal, had an erect gait, because that appears from the very beginning, almost 6 to 7 million years ago, at the beginning of the hominids, where the brain starts to increase only about 2 million years ago with Homo habilis. A good human anatomist, paleontologist, by looking at any bone of Lucy, surprising as it may seem to you, and it seems to me, know that she was bipedal. But I'm going to illustrate the situation with her pelvis, her hip bone, which I have drawn here next to a human pelvis and that of a gorilla or a chimpanzee. They are visually identical. I have enlarged it in size because Lucy was about 1 meter tall as an adult young woman, but so that we can compare the configuration of the hip. And it is clear that with a pelvis like that of Lucy, she couldn't walk the way chimpanzees and gorillas walk, knuckle walking with very long arms. For that, you need a very long hip bone. This is the way we walk. Well, Darwin used a lot of evidence from biogeography that I will not convey to you today, and a lot of evidence from comparative anatomy, arguing, as in the case showing here, that when you have the forelimb of a human, a dog, a bird, and a whale, we can see that they are all made up of the same bones organized in the same way. Why? The only sensible explanation is because they come from an ancestor, that Tiktaalik, that we saw a few moments ago between fish and amphibian. It's where these structures evolved, we have inherited those structures, but we have adapted them to different functions, for a dog to ride, a bird to run, a bird to fly, a whale to swim, and a human to write or to point out or to handle objects. The most convincing evidence for evolution comes from a discipline that didn't exist in Darwin's time. It has only been existent since the middle of the past century, for 50 years now. Molecular biology. Molecular biology gives the most convincing, most complete evidence for evolution. Moreover, allows us to reconstruct the history of living organisms. And I'm going to assert now something that many of you will find surprising. We can now reconstruct the history, the evolutionary history of any living species, the relationships between them, or whether very close or very remote, with as much precision as we may want. It's only a question of investing time and resources. But molecular biology, molecular components, DNA and proteins, have so much information in millions of letters, of units, that we can do that, and we do that. But molecular biology provides evidence for evolution in two ways. One of them has to do with the unity of life. All proteins and the enzymes that run all the processes that happen in our cells are made up of these 20 amino acids. Hundreds of amino acids exist that could have become integrated in proteins, but all organisms, from lowly bacteria to humans and everything in between, have their proteins and enzymes made up of the same 20 components, clearly reflecting a single origin. The ready material is in all organisms, not living organisms. DNA, a very simple molecule, could have been many other molecules to carry hereditary information. The dictionary that translates the information in the DNA into the information of proteins, there is a process there which is mediated by what we call the genetic code, is the same in all sorts of organisms. These matters can only be explained by assuming that indeed evolution had, the evolution of life had a single origin. How we use molecular biology to reconstruct history. I'm going to use the first major example published in 1967. This was the beginning of molecular biology, cytochrome C. Scientists used at that time this molecule because it's very small. It was at the time when our technology didn't allow us to obtain what we call the sequence of proteins. DNA we could not sequence then. Now we can do it very easily. My students can sequence the DNA of cytochrome C of the 20 species that I'm going to show you in one day. These scientists took several years. These were Emmanuel Margolies, a biochemist, and Walter Fitch, a very young evolutionist, who is the one who first developed the theory and the process to do these reconstructions. He was then, as I said, a young assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's now a not so young senior professor at the University of California, Irvine, in my department, 43 years later. So they obtained the sequence of this cytochrome C, this relatively speaking short molecule, and here the components are written. These are the amino acids. In the code that we use 3 letters for each amino acid. So in the top line is the sequence of the molecule for humans, and in here with glutamine, starting there with glutamic acid and going on. In the second line, you have the sequence of the same protein for rhesus monkey, and it's the same everywhere except for one difference, which I have highlighted here. And the third line is the horse, and there are 11 or 12 differences with humans or with monkeys. Notice that in the place, in this position where humans have isoleucine and monkeys have the same as horses and many other animals, which means that the change from threonine to isoleucine that we see there, the difference happened in the human lineage. So we not only can count differences, we can identify in which species took place, in which lineages. So with that information, I mean, we can construct a very trivial matrix here. Human to monkey, 1 difference, ignore the lower part. Human to horse, 12, rhesus to monkey, 11. So since evolution is a gradual process, even if we knew nothing else, we would conclude that humans and monkeys had a much more recent ancestor that they had with a horse. Well, we knew that. What was being done here is illustrating a methodology and showing the power of it. So one could construct this simple tree, a common ancestor of humans and monkeys, 1 change taking place in the human lineage, none in the monkey, and 11 somewhere from the common ancestor of 3 species to the horse and to the common ancestor of humans and monkeys. As you put more species, you fill in, and that's what they did by getting the sequences of 20 species, having this matrix. This cannot be solved by hand. They had to do it by computers. At that time, 1967, the first computers were becoming available in universities, and this is what the computer gives them. 2 billion years of evolution going from these common ancestor to the yeasts and fungi, to the animals, the another lineage, then splitting 1 to the insects, 1 to the vertebrates, and eventually all going to humans. 2 billion years of evolution reconstructed with just a tiny molecule. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of proteins and of genes. So there's there that I assert that we can reconstruct the evolutionary history of any species with as much detail as we may want, so long as we are ready to invest the resources and the time. This is the universal tree of life. Now we know that all living organisms have a single origin of life. Life may have originated on Earth more than once, but if that happened, other origins didn't leave descendants. And we have the 3 major groups of organisms: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are the creatures that have the organisms. They have complex cells, as we have with the nucleus, with the DNA, and other organelles. These other 2 groups are microscopic and have very simple cells. Most eukaryotes are also microscopic. They have these complex cells. This tree is constructed with a convention that the length of a branch is approximately proportional to the diversity of a species in that group of organisms. It is apparent to you, I'm sure, that we have here animals, fungi, and plants. They are the only multicellular organisms, the only organisms that our ancestors of 300 years ago knew to exist. And now we have all these others, all these microscopic, immensely more numerous than we are. Animals, we have about 1 million species described. There are many more that exist. We know that 99.9% of all species that exist, animal species that exist in the past, have become extinct. So there have been more than 1 billion animal species, and you can imagine all the billions of all these other organisms. What is the alternative to evolution? As you know, in recent years it has been proposed this notion of intelligent design, the theory of intelligent design, and it has been called, and I will just spend the last few minutes talking about intelligent design, pointing out first the critique of evolution is wrong, it's not science, and what I suppose might surprise many of you, that is contrary to religion. The proponents of intelligent design argue that there's a way, as it were, to argue for God and for religion. I think when one looks into it and understands the implications, it's all but that what is being accomplished. the sign, Michael Behe writes, is when a number of, we detect the sign, when a number of separate interacting components are ordered in such a way as to accomplish a function beyond the individual components. Well, that's what Paley was saying too. There's a big difference between Paley and Behe. Behe, among the writers of intelligent design, is the only one who is a bona fide biologist. He's not an evolutionist, he's a biochemist. He teaches at Lehigh University, but he's a scientist, a biologist. So the difference is that he knows about Darwin, but he says these complex designs are irreducibly complex. And what he means by that is that they cannot be produced by slight successive modifications of a precursor system. See, that's the way natural selection works. You remember taking advantage of variables, hereditary variants that are beneficial to organisms, and adding them up if they are beneficial in a particular environment. He says it won't work because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. Of course, this notion is completely wrong, and I'm going to very quickly show you how the eye, complex eye like ours, evolved, although I'm going to use mollusks to illustrate it, because we don't have to look at fossils. Mollusks, which include clams and oysters and snails and octopuses and squids, are much more diversified than vertebrates are, the animals with backbone, because they are much older, and also they live in more diversified environments, including environments like the ocean, which have changed very little over time. And if the environment does not change, there's no reason why things would change, and that's why we can see the early stages of evolution. And again, briefly, this is a creature, a limpet, that is very common in the intertidal rocks in where I live, in Southern California, say Newport Beach. And you see them there, small conical shells that if you watch carefully, they look like rocks, like variants in the configuration of the rocks. You look carefully, you see them moving slowly, they are grazing, they are eating the microalgae and other things that have been brought by the tide. What they need to know is whether there is light or not. When there is no light, the tide is on. They have to attach themselves to the rock because they are taken to the ocean, to the center of the ocean, they will die. If there is light, means the tide is down. This is time to eat, to take advantage of all those algae and other things that have been brought by the tide. By the way, you try to grab one of these limpets. It's impossible to pick them up. They attach themselves with such strength to the rock. And of course, they need to do that because the tides have tremendous strength. So what they need is a few pigmented cells with a few nerve fibers to carry the information to their brain. If there is light or there is no light, nothing else. Here you have another mollusk, a slit shell. This happens to be a nice favorite of mine because this is a mollusk that we eat in Spain a lot. They are called navajas, slit shells. In Spanish, navaja means a pocket knife. They are not eaten in the United States. They are eaten also in China. They don't exist in our coasts here. Now, this creature can not only see where is light or not, but also the direction of light. Here you have Nautilus, a snail that lives in the open sea, in the open ocean. This is one of the examples that Darwin uses of animals that have not changed for millions of years. They lived in the same environment. He don't know about the eye, but they have a very simple eye. They not only can detect the direction of light, but also movement. Here you have another marine snail, and then the octopus or squid. They have an eye very similar to us, with almost exactly the same parts, but they have an advantage over our eye. If you paid attention, of those of you who know it, we have a blind spot in the retina because the optic nerve, due to the evolutionary history of vertebrates, the optic nerve forms inside the eye. So to go to the brain has to cross the retina, and there we have a blind spot. And many of you, certainly I have experienced that when I go to the ophthalmologist. Now the octopuses and squids don't have that defect. From the beginning, as you saw, the fibers, the nerve fibers were formed in the outside, so the optic nerve forms in the outside and goes directly to the brain. One would have to agree, one is a proponent of intelligent design, that it is proof definitive that God loves octopuses and squids more than humans, which I don't think it will take anybody very far. Well, as you know, most of you surely know, in the fall of 2005, after the school district in Dover, in central Pennsylvania, have ordered biology teachers to read a statement about intelligent design as an alternative to evolution, the biology teachers refused to do. But in any case, the school district, the school board, was taken to court, and the trial lasted about 6 weeks, presided by John E. Jones III. Not a very suspicious character in this context. He is an evangelical Christian appointed to the federal court by George W. Bush. And yet, after 6 weeks of looking at the evidence, he formulated a decision which is completely destructive of intelligent design and arguing for evolution. He knew nothing about the subject before he started to deal with this case. Here he makes the theory, the ID movement misrepresents the status of the theory of evolution, causes students to doubt its validity, and presents the students with a religious alternative masquerading as a scientific theory. Well, I will make 2 or 3 points briefly. The first one, it is not science. Behe and Michael Behe, the biologist that I have pointed out, and others, like William Dembski, a sort of mathematician, and somebody else that I will cite in a moment, say that it is science. It is not science, because when we tell Behe, well, how do you count for the defects of organisms? He says, and I will allude to them in a moment more about defects. He says, well, how do I know what the intentions of the designer are? I don't know the intentions of the designer. So if I don't know the intentions of the designer, I cannot use design to test anything, whether this design or not, or anything else. In fact, there have been no any hypothesis or any research. I like to advance this quotation from Philip Johnson. This is a retired professor of law from Berkeley, one of the leading proponents of intelligent design, who in 1998 made this statement, give us 5 or 10 years. 5 years went by, 10 years went by. There's not a single piece of evidence in favor of intelligent design. It is not science. But the next point is that it is contrary to religion. Let me briefly point out that some obvious defects, could point out to very many others, but one is the human jaw. You know, the human jaw, as surely you all know, is not sufficiently big for our teeth, so that we have to have the wisdom teeth removed, 1 or 2 or 3 or all 4. An engineer that would have designed the human jaw could be fired the next day. Are you going to claim that God designed that? The human birth canal, not sufficiently big for the birth of the baby. We know that, why that happened is the tremendous enlargement of our brain. You know, chimpanzees don't suffer birth pains, nor there is mortality of the millions of infants, of infant humans that have happened through history and mothers because of this defect of the sign. So we have imperfect, incompetent, dysfunctional design. There's a lot of cruelty in the way of life, in the ways of life. One example there, baboons, most other primates that we think they're very nice creatures, they are not. But baboons, the example that I'm referring to there, live in troops where is a dominant male, and then there are a number of females, most of which are have carrying babies which are still being milked. They're lactating. Well, when a dominant baboon male dies or is replaced by other dominant male, so one way or another, the first thing that the new male does is to kill all the babies. Because if the babies are there, the mothers will not go into estrus. If he kills them, they go into estrus, the new male mates with them, so they carry his genes, not the genes of the previous guy. So any genes that will move a male to kill the babies that are lactating will be favored relative to genes that will not move a male to do that, because the one who kills the babies will be able to mate right away with the females and leave more descendants. But not a very nice sort of behavior when we look at it from the outside. I notice here some oddities, the praying mantis that you probably have heard of, these insects that have the four legs like this and look as if they are praying. And you probably have heard the story that after they mate, the female eats the male. That is the PG-13 version. The real version is the female tries, and most of the time succeeds, in eating the head of the male first, then mounts the male, has much more successful fertilization that way, and then of course eats the rest of the male afterwards. Now, these insects, like many others, male only once in their life. So this is the best that the male can do for his genes, to be eaten by the female so that she is healthy and produces babies that carry the genes of the male. So this is expected to in evolution, but from the point of view of designing engineer, super engineer, that doesn't make much sense. Well, there are thousands of species, almost all spiders, many crabs, many kinds of insects do the mate in this way, with all sorts of variations. Some cases, the females eat the mate first, before mating, some during, and some afterwards. By the way, my female students love when I tell them these stories, where the female always ends eating the mate. But sometimes before, take the case of the midge flies, these sort of summer flies that are common in some parts in Europe and in the United States, where here the female, when she wants to mate, takes her proboscis, inserts it inside the male. The outside of the male is no good, it's a shell, it's not nutritious. But so takes an enzyme and digests all the inside of the male, swallows it, swallows the genitals complete, and once she has them inside, use another enzyme to digest the shell, the membrane that covers the genitals, and gets fertilized. And is, of course, very well nourished. Hundreds and hundreds of species do this kind of thing. I won't tell you the variation of this of bed bugs, which are being in the media recently, because apparently they are infesting our hotels and homes, and so there's a variation of that even more amusing. But I will stop that part at this point. We have also a sort of parasitism. I mean, parasites exist only to kill their hosts. It seems a sadistic way. So that's why I say evolution is Darwin's gift to religion. With the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, a problem of component of the problems of the Odyssey were at least given a principle of solution. We don't have now to explain volcanic eruptions of the earthquake that killed 250,000 Haitians a couple of years ago, a year and a half, or 5 years before the tsunami that killed another 200,000 Indonesians. Those things were explained as actions of God, rewarding or punishing some people. Now we knew that they were the result of natural processes. The same with Darwin. Now that we have evolution, we can account for these kinds of state of affairs that I have been telling you about, and that raise the question about the presence of evil in the living world. We can now explain them as the result of natural processes rather than as the result of specific design by the Creator. This is a book that I wrote with the same title as the lecture of today. Thank you very much.
Well, as we had mentioned, we have a microphone here on my left and one on the right. It's close enough that we can see you. If you do have any questions, please come forward and share your questions. Thank you for raising the light as well. Oh.
Us will be even better.
Yes, so if you use the mic, please, which is just within 3 or 4 rows from the beginning of the room.
Hello. Yeah, I thought this was very interesting. One of the things that I was surprised by was how you moved to the conclusion that intelligent design is contrary to religion. And you know, a lot of what you said there seemed to just be pointing out some kind of version of the problem of evil. And it strikes me that if there was a good answer, maybe something like, I don't know, Hicks, Irenaean theodicy or something like that. But if there was a good answer to the problem of evil, then it seems then that maybe ID wouldn't be contrary to religion. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, first, there is not a good answer. There is not any answer. Second, it has no substance, scientific substance either. But with respect to the problem of evil, what answer do we have if we assume that God has designed organisms? Let me tell you something which is to me one of the most shocking considerations. You know, the human reproductive system, the DNA, is so badly designed, and we understand why things happen the way they happened, that 20% of all human pregnancies end in a spontaneous abortion during the first 2 months of pregnancy. 20% of all pregnancies. There's more than 20 million spontaneous abortions because of the human reproductive system so badly designed. So to me, saying that God designed the human reproductive system amounts to blasphemy.
Another question? Please come forward.
Thank you very much for a very engrossing presentation. But do you think it is plausible to believe that God designed the format or the process of natural selection so that there is, in some sense, a divine design under and through the process you have presented as natural selection?
Yeah, well, nothing that I have said excludes in my mind, and I hope in the minds of anybody who cares to understand the issues, the presence of God in the universe, even in the process of evolution. let me take one example, simple to say what I mean, to explain what I mean. Let us consider the human being. Most of us would agree that all of us have been conceived in the womb of our mother from an ovule that was fertilized by sperm, and that cell divided into 2, 4, and eventually a little baby came out, and we keep growing up and transforming groceries into ourselves. So we can accept the natural processes and still see ourselves as creatures of God. You know, for me, religion and science are like two windows through which we can look at the world. We see different things, but it is the same world, and they don't need to be in contradiction. The contradictions arise when we may want to use religion for scientific explanations, or scientists who may use science to contradict religion. You know, there are very few, can be counted almost with the fingers of a hand, scientists who seem to be making a living out of saying that science proves that God does not exist, you know, which there is no way in which science can show that any more than it can show that God exists. This is my point. I think so long as we stay within the separate domains, we can see the presence of God in the whole process of evolution, as we can see it in the process of our individual lives.
Another, please come forward. And thank you. I think you could, if you think you want to ask a question, just come closer and we can do it faster. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. But in a sense, I'm going to elaborate and ask you a question. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the same question you got before. I don't see in what sense Darwin made a gift to religion. I see your point that intelligent design may be not a gift to religion because it makes God look incompetent, but what did Darwin,
Well,
in what sense did Darwin make a gift to religion? It seems to me that we are facing the same problem, either cruelty or just the laws of nature left to themselves. What kind of a creator is that?
Yeah, but we have earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and tsunamis, and we don't have to interpret them as God trying to punish the Haitians or the people in Indonesia or the people in Herculanum and Pompeii, you know, in the year 70 of the Christian era, which was very much interpreted as an action of God against those people because we were depraved. The Copernican revolution freed us from having to attribute those deeds to the specific act of the Creator, so that we explain them as the result of natural processes. Darwin's theory of natural selection allows us to explain the phenomena of the living world and as the result of natural processes. You see, that cruelty and sadism are not immoral events or immoral actions. They are natural processes. Animals and continents they are not moral subjects. So the morality disappears. If they are the act of a moral subject, then we have a moral problem. We have a theodicy problem. But if they're the result of natural process, you know, if I live across a natural reserve and my wife and I walk and we see coyotes there, if a coyote attacks us, we don't see this as a moral evil action. Now, if we have a neighbor who carries a dog, they don't do that. But assuming that they does and uses the dog to attack us, that attack of the dog is a moral act. So it's the difference of subject.
Thank you.
Please, over here.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on this award. And I think this award speaks to your hard work, but also who you are as a person. And so I was wondering if your work that so broadly expands our perspective, both on the divine and on science, I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit about how that assists you in your daily life, coping with all the minutiae of life that we deal with, and how a length of perspective like this Any words of advice that you have to many of us who also love ideas but get also very caught up in the small things of life? What words would you have for us?
Maybe you should ask my wife. I enjoy life. I enjoy doing science, and I live, for most purposes, an ordinary life, very visible academic life, if you wish. And I think in life what one has to do is something that fulfills our own expectations, but also where we seek to accomplish something that may be of service to others. I'm afraid I cannot be more explicit than that, not because I don't want to be explicit, it's just because I don't think I have anything interesting to say, except that just do what you want to do and do it well and try to accomplish something.
Please.
Yes, this is something, I have a little bit of a narrative before I ask the question, but I was sort of a creation scientist at one time, and then I heard Jack Rogers debate Dwayne Gish. You may know who he is, but he's a creation scientist.
Oh, yes, I know.
And he convinced me of Rogers convinced me of theistic evolution, and in my view, I thought I wanted that is a God-directed evolution is the way that I kind of came to think of it. And then later on, I started teaching a science and religion course with the Templeton grant, and we used Ian Barber's book, and that evolution is, and if Ian Barber's here, he can correct me.
Yes, he's
but,
here.
all right, well, maybe it was you or another person, but it suggested that evolution was necessarily random and that it was God's sort of way of searching out all possibilities. And so evolution was God's, not directed, but is God's random way of searching out all possibilities for life. And that was, so I kind of adopted that. And then essay came across my desk the other day by Alvin Platinga, who argued that the fact that there are natural processes doesn't mean that there's not a purpose behind that God used natural processes, but doesn't mean that there's a purpose in mind behind it. So I don't know, if we're in there, are you with the kind of God searching out all possibilities, or God directed?
Let me make first a comment. I don't think any evolutionist will say that evolution is a random process. There are random components in the process. Mutations arise at random. Natural selection is anything but random. It's the reproduction of things which are beneficial at the expense of things which are less beneficial. That's how organisms become adapted to the environment. Now, I myself have no problem, and I would argue there is no need to see a problem between seeing the presence of God in the natural process and still recognizing the natural process. As I said, these are two different ways of looking at the world. Let me take a moment to see whether this will work. Take the Guernica. This is considered one of the great masterpieces of art of the 20th century, and as might be obvious to you, a painting I greatly admire. Assume that I now give you the exact dimensions, the nature of the canvas, the pigments that Picasso used, even the coordinates of various brush stroke. And so I tell you, you have now a complete description of the painting. That's what the Guernica is. And if you are interested in art, or a sensible person, you will respond, you have not told me anything about the Guernica or what I want to know. I'm interested in why it was painted, the purpose, what does it mean, aesthetic value. So I see the same between the natural explanation of science. When science has its say, there is a lot of things to be said about the world, which they don't need to be in opposition. They are different dimensions. So I just think that one can live with science and accept science as explanation at one level and have other explanations at other levels, including, of course, the religious one.
Sir.
Francisco, I want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
15 years ago, when we were at Syracuse University conference together, out of ignorance and total misapplication. I remember when someone from the floor accused you of being something short of an atheist when you presented your theory as a gift. And I certainly want to thank the Templeton Foundation and Dr. Jack Templeton for helping to bring that reality of science and God or understanding closer together and not being in conflict. As one who personally sees any scientific discovery just a way of increasing our awe and wonder for the greatness of creation, I wonder whether we're about to perhaps reach another what I would call Copernican moment, when perhaps out of that our consciousness of the understanding of that which is science and that which is, if I can use the term theology or religion, are actually complementary. And out of that consciousness, perhaps we can move forward to another level of understanding.
Well, that would be wonderful. I think that's what many of you and many of us are trying to do, except that we usually are able to advance, one fraction of an inch at a time, and you need probably the genius of some greatly insightful person to provide us with major advances. Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist who worked in the second quarter of the 20th century as a paleontologist and whose books were published after his death in 1955, trying to accomplish exactly what you have said. And he saw evolution going towards a kind of super organism in the next stage. But I will leave it at that. I think your idea is very interesting. We need some geniuses to accomplish the next advances.
Yes, ma'am, a last question?
Well, thank you. I feel privileged to be able to ask the last question. Thank you for your eloquent presentation. It is beautiful to hear you speak and present this field that you love so much. And I agree, of course, with everything that you've said, especially that God does not intervene with tsunamis and earthquakes and all of this, or in coyotes that could possibly ambush us. But that leaves the question open of how does God intervene in history? Does God intervene? Does God answer my prayers? And it's not a question I think we have any answers to, but I still want to hold on to that interventionist God when it's in my favor. I'm not quite ready to let go of that yet, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how does God intervene, if at all, in history?
Okay. I have some theologian friends who are interventionists. Ian Arbor and I have a dear friend, and he's also known by some others here, who is very much of an interventionist, somebody who was trained as a physicist, but now a pastor and directs a very major center of research in science and theology. Some of my other theologian friends do not like to hear the word intervention. They prefer to hear the word presence. We can see the presence of God without necessarily intervening there. And I think that may be what you meant. And in that case, I will go back to my reference to an individual, as I did before, to a person, or to the Guernica. You can have a description at one level. It has not touched the description at another level. Theological description does not have to depend on the scientific description any more than it may have something to do in the case of the Guernica, but the aesthetic description is completely different from the description of the pigments and the coordinates and the nature of the canvas. They belong to different realm of knowledge and different realms of reality, because values exist, whether aesthetic, moral, and religious. We are talking about religion and science. There are many other things in between, including aesthetics and ethics and other matters, other ways to look at the world and to evaluate the world. Science is only one of them. It's a very important and productive one, and I make a good living out of it, but it's certainly not the only one.
Well, thank you. I hope that although my father's not able to be with us, that you might appreciate in some sense how much he would have enjoyed and valued this program. and not just a one-way communication, but you've provided by way of questions. And I even think Francisco may have a few questions he's going back possibly and ponder as well because of the thoughtfulness you provided. So Dad would have started, if he could be here, the program of saying how much a joy it was to be with you and how much he loves you, and he would have concluded that same way. So that's pretty affirmational. So I will ask you first, how many of you have ever been to one of our prior AAR lecture events featuring the Templeton Prize? Well, that's a joy itself, that you've been to previous ones and you've come back again. I won't say this is quite true, but what I wish is that we had quite yet a perfect DNA retina camera so that we all had, in effect, your DNA email to make sure that you come join us next year. So in Dad's Southern tradition, he would have said, you all come again now, you hear? But the evening's not over. So part of the fellowship that we hope that you will have a time to spend a half an hour or so with us is to join us in the Hanover room downstairs. I'm sure we can all find it once we get down one further level. And again, if it's not too much of a theistic concept, that maybe our mind is a gift, and then might we find where that gift came from, and that might be the greatest part of that gift is language, because without language, we couldn't have appreciated what Professor Ayala had to share with us. To wit, I have to run downstairs and talk to the musicians to make sure that they will be providing only music from the 1950s and 60s, because that was the last music you could understand what the words were. So if you remember the words, we'll even sing together. So please come downstairs and we'll enjoy a nice, relaxing time together. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.